Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I want to welcome you to our panel tonight called Let's Talk Immigration, hosted by the Network for Responsible Public Policy. Immigration policy has been contentious throughout American history. We all learn about our immigrant experience and the challenges facing us today. What is the best way forward that honors this history and the values and also our future? Three experts tonight will discuss our past, current situation, and ways to go forward. What does the data tell us about immigration impact in our communities and finding solutions for dreamers? And I wanted to say, New Jersey is actually, people often say that the United States is a nation of immigrants, but New Jersey certainly is a state of immigrants. It has one of the highest immigrant populations in the whole country. So any immigration policies that we're seeing, any of the contentious debates, are very much impacting the communities in our own backyards, even if we don't always see them. So I think this is an extremely timely topic that has a lot of implications, not just nationally, but definitely in New Jersey as well. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm the host for tonight. My name is Nadia Hussein. As my day job, I'm the Maternal Justice Campaign Director at a national organization called Moms Rising. Moms Rising is a nonprofit that champions policies that positively impact families and children. And one of the areas we do work around is immigration. We actually have a Spanish-speaking arm of our organization called Mamas con Poder. So it is an issue that we do work on. We work on very strongly federally and statewide. And I'd love to introduce our panelists for tonight, and I'll go from left to right. First, we have John A. Gronbeck Tedesco. He is the Associate Professor and Associate Professor and Convener of American Studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He has had many writings, many pieces on the subject of immigration. Jeremy Robbins, next to him, is Executive Director of the New American Economy, a bipartisan coalition of more than 500 CEOs and mayors making the economic case for immigration reform. And last but certainly not least, we have Katie Reisner, who serves as the Senior Policy Advisor to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's Commissioner for Immigrant Affairs. And so many of you, I think, might have been here before, but for those of you that haven't, each of the panelists will have about 15 to 20 minutes to speak. A lot of them have a wonderful, very educational slide that they'll present. And then at the end of their presentations, I would ask that you hold your questions for a question and answer session. So with that, I'll start. Come up, John. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you to Rhoda and the Network for Responsible Public Policy, as well as my fellow co-panelists, and of course all of you for joining us this evening and allowing me to really shed some opening remarks about immigration history. It's a class I regularly teach at Ramapo College, where I'm an associate professor, and I find that it's interesting to students, I think, because often lacking from debates today is a kind of perspective, a historical perspective of immigration in this country. I'm going to ask Cynthia. Oh, okay. So I'll keep. It's warming up. Okay. Well, I am too, so that's okay. One of the interesting things about immigration in the United States is not that it's contentious. It's not exceptional in terms of the United States as a nation state to have contentious debates over immigration. This is one of the things that defines modern national sovereignty, modern nation states, determining who can come, who must remain out, who can become a citizen. These debates shape nations all over the world. What is interesting and unique about the United States, however, is that so much of our national identity, our history, our narratives, relies on immigration. We tell ourselves, and we have told ourselves, well back into the 19th century, that we are a nation of immigrants, and that is the bedrock of our strength. Today, between 1% and 2% of people living in the United States claim indigenous heritage. Overwhelmingly, we are a country who have stories consisting of stories of people who have come here as immigrants, as migrants, as slaves, and going back far enough as prisoners, as convicts, as religious missionaries. So the making of this country relies on a kind of outsiderness that certainly becomes divisive in certain moments. So what I hope to do in my short time here is to kind of bring up some of these moments, not to say that today is just like 1920 or 1880. I don't think history serves us best that way, but it does serve us to kind of give us some sort of context for how we deploy certain ideas about national membership, how we create fear or suspicion, how we construct otherness, what sort of messages, what kind of institutions and organizations, what kind of scholarly trajectories do we rely on to create, construct threat, and then to contain it. And so that's what I'll be embarking on here. And if we could get the slides, that's great. But if not, I'll. Okay, that's okay. So the first major point I want to make is that throughout much of American history, contrary to I think what many people think, is that the United States, really until World War I, had a fairly open border, or a very loose border policy. Many people were able to come. You see here a slide, and I don't know if you guys want to come to the audience to see the slides. I'm not forcing you to move, but it might be if you're comfortable. If you see here, this is a graph that goes back to 1850, and you see the number of immigrants coming, foreign-born population, till 2010, and you see the top line is the percentage of the population that those people comprise. And roughly today, the graph only goes to 2010, roughly today there's about 45 million people who are foreign-born, which is approximately 14 to 15% of the population. And I think this is important to think about because it does wax and wane in terms of how many people are foreign-born. And of course, it's not just, when we think about foreign-born or immigrants in the U.S., it's not just people who are actually immigrants, but it's also their sons and daughters, they're our neighbors. They become a much larger part of our communities than just the people themselves. The next slide will show predictions on if current trends continue, the numbers of immigrants, the percentage of the United States that will be foreign-born by 2060. Now, of course, so those are the red bars there, the future. This depends on a lot of things. It depends on policies, it depends on laws, of course it depends on world events, it depends on changes in labor and the way that capital moves around the globe. Next slide. But to my first point, largely, really until World War I, immigration was largely unfettered. You had, a growing population, and that still continues to grow today. I mean, explosive because of immigrants. Next slide. Okay, and then next, yeah. So until roughly 1880, that's great. People are able to come, and they're able to come in large numbers. And really the height of immigration history in the United States are the years 1880 to 1924. And the end of the 19th century, it becomes an important point in this story because there are sort of twin developments in the American nation. On the one hand, America is looking to expand commercially, economically. It is looking to compete with other foreign powers such as France, England, Germany, Russia. And there is now a much more heated conversation about where is the United States going to go. We're already continentally contained from Maine to California. There is effectively no more westward expansion. All native populations have been contained by 1890 through various Indian wars. And so there's a lot of press and worry about where the U.S. will continue to grow. And that will then be the emergence of modern American empire. That will bring eventually the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the United States gets in its possession Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. And it is thinking, the nation is thinking about how to increase its prestige and influence abroad. Well, the flip side of that, then, is numbers, many people coming to the United States to help build this new 19th century going into the 20th century economy. So between 1880 and 1924, there's some 27 million immigrants that come to the United States, and of course, those are the ones that are documented. Next point, Cynthia, please. There is this kind of push for cosmopolitanism, for modernity. Now attached to American nationalism is a sense of worldliness that wasn't there before. It wasn't that the U.S. wasn't international before 1880, but now more and more Americans and immigrants coming to the United States, becoming new Americans, are fashioning a national identity that is based on a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of globalism, right? You don't have to go there. You can come to the United States and see there, here. So these are kind of twin vectors that are working in concert, and it causes the population to grow, and of course the economy. Next, thanks. But with this, of course, is an anxiety. There's a need for foreignness, for immigrants in the nation, but with this comes an anxiety around what Teddy Roosevelt, whenever you want to look for a good quote from, you go to Teddy Roosevelt, but he called these barbarian others. We must not lose these barbarian virtues, and of course barbarian meaning kind of outsiders. So there's this anxiety that really comes up during this time. The need for foreign labor, the need to expand, the need to grow internally as well as externally, but also the questions around the cost of that. A cost because race science is governing a lot of how people are seeing and weighing immigrants. Yeah, immigrants are needed to grow the economy, but people asked, people at Harvard, at Yale, at Ivy League institutions who were part of this larger race science that was developing at this time. This would be eugenics around the turn of the century. These are questions around immigrant stock, as it was called, blood, or what we called race. This is before the divergence of race and culture, before culture became a way to explain different patterns of human behavior. We take culture now to be much more social. Race has not gone away, of course, as a model of explanation, nor has racism. But around 1900, the different peoples of the world were thought of as different races of people, races of man, as many people wrote about around 1900. So there is a fear around thinking about what will happen when different stocks, quote unquote, of people come to the United States, and will they pollute this kind of idealized Anglo-Saxon heritage and race? This is a time when anti-miscegenation laws go on the books in all states. This is anti-race mixing laws. It becomes illegal to intermarry. And so this enters the debates around immigration. Next point, please. Right on the tail of this, of course, is World War I. World War I is, it's a gigantic event, of course, globally in Europe and the United States. And one of the things it does is it brings to the fore two issues: refugees and territorial sovereignty. So refugee is a term that goes back to the 17th century, but in terms of a modern legal subject, refugee is a 20th century construct. More people are nationless after World War I. More national boundaries are shifting than they had. And of course, this will only be eclipsed by World War II. But by 1920, more nations are shifting territorial boundaries. This is the creation of the modern Middle East. And more people are in effect nationless or are switching national allegiances. So this puts in sharp relief the need to police borders. All right, so the United States, like many other nations, starts trying to, or creating basically a modern border. You can go to the next slide. You've got Ellis Island. I'm just going to grab some. Ellis Island is created offshore because it wasn't the main port of entry for immigrants. It's created offshore because it's meant to be a kind of station, right? A place where people can get checked out before being admitted to the mainland. You can go to the next slide. In the West Coast, this would be Angel Island. Again, a place where people are medically evaluated before being granted access to the mainland. What's really interesting is I think we know this history, and at least in terms of Ellis Island, the rate of exclusion was very low until the 19-teens and 1920s. May Nye, who's written a lot on immigration history, estimates that only 1% of people who came through Ellis Island were actually turned away. So I think in our popular culture, we think like Ellis Island was this kind of big moment, and a lot of people made it, but many people were turned away. But it's actually not true. A lot of people were granted access. So this would be the West Coast, and of course the southern border, El Paso, 19-teens or 20s. So before this, there wasn't strict policing. I mean, there's a border, but it's not nearly what we might think of today as a border. Next slide. These represent the different racial and ethnic classifications of, say, a Newark that is changing so rapidly. I mean, we've got, large numbers of people entering our cities and growing, by the tens of thousands, different ethnicities. I mean, here you would have Italians, you'd have Poles, Germans, etc., as well as some Chinese, if you can see the Chinese section of the city. Next slide, please. This is a wonderful visual, there's a wonderful visual archive of this time too. I just point to this photographer, Augustus Sherman. There's also Lewis Hine, Jacob Riis, who were very interested in documenting immigrants. Here you have Sherman's work. Hindu boy in 1911. Hindu would have been a South Asian Indian. Hinduism is a religion. It was the way to classify people of South Asia, specifically India, which of course would have been Britain at this time. Next slide, yeah. You also, part of this is the West Coast, and also, and you can put all the pictures up there at once to get a sense of Asian immigration to the West Coast. I think it's really important to think about, East Coast, West Coast, of course, the southern border as well, and northern border. Chinese were among the larger numbers of Asian nationals coming in the 1860s, first coming for the gold rush, and then staying and constructing the transcontinental railroad, making up somewhere like 90% of the labor force. And Hawaii, so after 1898, Hawaii is a U.S. territory, which becomes then a way by which many Asian nationals, Koreans, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese make their way to the mainland. Next slide. We have South Asian Sikhs or Sikhs. 1900, again, railroad workers. Low numbers, mostly men at this time, few thousand probably. Yeah. And with this, you can put all the pictures up there, yeah. Is just then, of course, a catalog of exclusion at different times. I mean, the Irish face exclusionary social norms, although not laws, norms. Some laws, but not federal laws. The Chinese are the most notable in terms of restriction. They will, their entry into the West will bring about lobbying efforts from working class white men in California, Nevada, Oregon, and other places to basically lobby Congress to exclude Chinese from coming to the United States. So in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, which categorically excludes Chinese people from coming to the U.S. This will be renewed in 1892 with the Geary Act, and Chinese cannot come to the United States until World War II, until 1943. You see there, you probably can't see the sign, it says no Filipinos on the door in the middle, and of course this is a New York Times article showing Hindus or South Asian Indians driven out of a town in California. Next slide. After 1892, if you were of Chinese origin, you had to carry identification proving that you had the right, legal right to be in the United States. And these political cartoons, such as the one you see on the left, were just very common in the day. You saw these not just in the West Coast, but also in Boston and New York. Chinese became one of the measures, one of the kind of go-to images of what was wrong with America's immigration policy. And if you allow the Chinese to come, the Filipinos, and eventually Japanese, you will have this kind of this sort of Asianizing of America, which, in the kind of racial science eugenics framework was everything that was seen as antithetical to, white Anglo-Saxon ideals. The other thing that people worried about around World War I were radicals, what were called agitators in the day. Europeans that came to the United States were being targeted as anarchists, as socialists, and communists. And indeed, many of these working class folks came from Europe and helped to organize American unions and did start socialist, communist, anarchist groups. I mean, one of the most notable anarchist was Emma Goldman, who would be deported during World War I for her activism, for her radicalism, deported to Russia. So these images, close the gate on the right, and you see the guy on the left throwing a bomb at the American flag, but it's a boomerang, so it's going to come back and destroy him instead. You got the guy carrying the luggage. It says undesirable, and these are very common visual motifs that you see at this time in Chicago, and I think that might be Minnesota or Baltimore, but throughout the press. This is an image from eugenics, the International Congress of Eugenics meeting in 1921. The idea that you can do the science of good breeding, right? If you put all the social sciences and hard sciences together, you can actually breed out, what were called at the time degenerate traits, and the list was long on what was believed to be able to be bred out. And everything from pauperism, or poverty, alcoholism, to what we would call today any number of special needs. In the day, it was, insanity, feeble-mindedness, all under this kind of umbrella term defective. Right, next slide. Well, the sort of political circumstances of World War I, the eugenics science that was pervasive in the kind of upper echelons of knowledge making at the time, leads to the 1917 Immigration Act, over the veto of Woodrow Wilson. The act essentially consolidates the list of undesirables, as it was called, banned from entering the U.S. Alcoholics, anarchists, epileptics, criminals, convicts. There was a clause in there, persons with constitutional psychopathic inferiority, which would have meant homosexuals. Literacy was now required for people over 16. And it also installed what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. So now people from China, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia were barred from coming to the United States. There were some exceptions for people who were residents of Hawaii and the Philippines, because the United States, those were U.S. territories at the time. Next slide. And then a mere 7 years later, the larger, more sustaining act was the Immigration Act of 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act. This capped the number of immigrants that could come to the U.S. to around 160,000 a year, and it based those numbers on quotas, which in the number of people that could come from a country was based on the 1890 census. 2% of that number could now come to the United States. So this overwhelmingly favored West Europeans, Northern Europeans, and excluded nearly all Asians. And even people like Italians, their numbers plummeted, 70 or 80%. One more thing about this. 1924 is the time we get a consular control system of immigration, which divides responsibility for immigration between the State Department and the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It mandated that no alien could allow the U.S. without a valid immigration visa issued by a consular officer abroad. Okay, next. So this is a graph showing the decline in immigration after 1924. It's effectively the construction of the modern illegal alien, the construction of someone who is admitted but should not be here or should be refused. It put into a definition excludability from the nation. Illness, radicalism, illiteracy, moral turpitude, these are the kind of categories for excludability that are ossified in the 1924 moment. Deportation skyrockets. I think many Americans think we've always deported people. We haven't. Between 1908 and 1920, we deported roughly 2,000 to 3,000 people a year, usually from jails, asylums, hospitals. After 1924, we began to deport more people. 40,000 people were deported in 1929. And of course, in recent years, we've topped 450,000 a year, as you'll see in a moment. Next slide. Well, 1965, the Great Society brings a ray of light on this discussion. Lyndon Johnson, we're in the Cold War, and Johnson is facing, a world that is looking for American guidance, American prestige, and part of this is congressional work to do away with the 1924 law. And so the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, the Hart-Celler Act, now scraps the quota issue and allows 20,000 people from every country to come, as well as then paves the path for families, right? So if you are able to come and become a permanent resident, you can then sponsor families, right, spouses, families, as well as there are different categories of labor. So now there's an expansion of the number of people who can come to the United States. Next slide. So you see a difference between 1960 and the top nations for immigrants in the U.S. in 2013. And I realize I'm getting low on time. I just have a couple more. So that's the reigning law until 1986, when Ronald Reagan signs the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which was passed by a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. This was an effort to stem, to help prevent illegal immigration. It didn't do so. It made it illegal to hire workers who didn't have proper documentation, and it required employers to verify immigration status, but it also famously granted asylum to people who were here and without criminal record before 1982. So this would be some 3 million people who would go on to do this in the wake of this law. So this brings us to the question of immigration policy today. You see deportations under the last 4 administrations, and you see the numbers going up. And thinking about this historically, as I just mentioned, this is kind of a new trend in the United States. It's certainly affected by 9/11, but what we'll talk about, I think, is some of the other factors. This is the current border wall or border fence. The students I teach are surprised that there is a fence there. They think, I don't know what they think, but they think that this is, the suggestion now is that we're going to put $25 billion and build something that wasn't there. That may be true, but there is over 650 miles of border fence, as well as I did graduate school in Texas, and there is border security even 50 miles to 100 miles in state. You can drive on interstates and be stopped by Border Patrol, and you're 50 miles from the border. We hear about the millions coming through the border. It's more like hundreds of thousands. These are the numbers of apprehensions. You see those have declined significantly, again, because ostensibly to commitments to the border security, drones, personnel, etc. Yeah, it's an interesting graph. And these are, of course, pictures of what we got. Next slide. And then I think I have one more slide. This is a Quinnipiac poll that sort of charted opinion around the question, do you favor or oppose building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border to try to stop illegal immigration? You see right around the election, the favor and oppose were closer, and then even just within months, that begins to change, except for the people who just have nothing to say, the gray line. So I think that's interesting. I think that says something about our media too. I mean, how within just a few months do those numbers change? It's probably, you could make the argument that has to do with how media is handling it, where this is on the radar, et cetera. Okay, I'll conclude my section there and pass it on to Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was great. Thank you, Rhoda. Thank you all for having me today. I have the task of taking us to the present and talking about the economics and the politics of immigration. So my name is Jeremy Robbins. I'm the executive director of New American Economy. And New American Economy is an organization that Michael Bloomberg started 8 years ago with a very specific theory about immigration that relates to a lot that was in John's slides, which is to say, we have a system of immigration that effectively was put in place in 1965. So John talked about moving away from a system of racial quotas to a system of family-based reunification. And that was a huge advance in 1965, right? To move away from this idea that was inherently racist about how some immigrants are good and some were bad, but even when we did that, the system was flawed. It was a system that was based on this idea that reuniting families was our principal goal, and it should be. That's a hugely important goal. But in a global economy, it hasn't worked on a lot of levels. There are some visas for employers, but that's an afterthought. We have a system where we've tried to have huge controls at the border, but it stopped all circular migration flows. And so you have a system where on about 3 or 4 different levels, really fundamental levels, it doesn't work. On a security level, we spend billions and billions of dollars on the border. We've militarized our border. We're putting people in prisons. Yet we haven't stopped the fact that 11 million people live here who are undocumented. And those people we're not going to deport. We're deporting 400,000 a year. We have 11 million people who are here. We're not going to spend the hundreds of billions of dollars that it's going to cost. It would wreak havoc on our economy. And at the same time, we have a system where we can't get workers that we need. So the theory of New American Economy was we've had 50 years to change that. And we've repeated history every single time. We have a debate every 3 or 4 years in Congress. You've lived through many of them. They sound really similar. They end in exactly the same way. And so the theory was that immigration advocacy was based on this idea of how do you get people really ginned up over it on both sides? How do you motivate your base and not on how you win? So if you go to the next slide. So when we started 8 years ago, there were 2 very different conversations on immigration happening in the country. On the left, there was a conversation about human rights, about families, about deportations. And on the right, there's a conversation about terrorism and national security and law and order. And both of those are actually important conversations, and people would use them to nominate candidates that excited their base and that would win. And then there was this food fight in Congress that you see every 3 or 4 years where people are speaking past each other. And the theory of New American Economy, if you go to the next slide, was that you need to find a middle ground. You need to find a way to talk about it. And for Michael Bloomberg, sitting in New York City right across the river where 48% of companies are owned by immigrants, where we have 50 million tourists a year because it's a diverse and exciting place and people want to see that, immigration is part of the lifeblood of the economic strategy. The theory is that if you could actually make that part of the conversation, if you could tell this economic story that I'll talk about in a second, 1, you'd get better policy that would work better, but 2, you could break through a lot of the political divide. And so I'm going to try and do something which is very difficult in this current political environment and give a very optimistic take on immigration. And that's not easy, but we'll see if you feel it's warranted afterwards. But let's start with the economic case for immigration. I think that has been a resounding success over the last 8 years. If you go to the next slide. So this is where Pew does a survey, and they ask the same question every single year. Are immigrants taking jobs, or are they strengthening the economy? And for a long time, Americans were largely split. They thought it was about half and half, basically an open question. But if you look what's happened over the last 8 years, as more and more advocates have started making this part of the debate, trying to force this issue, to make us have an honest conversation about how it impacts, if you go to the next part, there's been a huge divergence in Pew's survey. And what ends up happening is now twice as many Americans think that immigrants are good for our economy as bad. And even more importantly, if you go one more time, is for millennials. It's four times as many millennials think that immigrants are good for our economy as bad for it. And I think there's a positive story to that, which is that this argument's creating traction, that they're getting forced to this fate. The negative side is I think it has emboldened the opposition. So let me give you the economic argument in a nutshell, and then let's talk about the politics and how you break through. And there are a lot of different ways that immigrants impact our economy. Not all good, some certainly bad, but by and large in a genuinely positive way. And I'll give you 5 today very quickly, but there are many others that we can talk about. But I'll talk about 5 challenges that are facing our economy. First one is entrepreneurship. If you go to the next slide, we live in a world right now where we have a big problem with new businesses. All net job growth for the last 30 years comes from new businesses, but Americans are starting fewer and fewer. Well, immigrants historically have been a great thing for American business. You think about our greatest companies, our iconic companies that lead around the world, our Fortune 500 companies, 40% of them were started by an immigrant or a child of immigrants. If you go to the next slide. But here's what's happening, is that fewer and fewer Americans are starting companies. So you think about what are the next 40 Fortune 500 companies going to look like, and who knows, go one more. And immigrants turn out to help fill a lot of this gap. So in 2010, immigrants were 13% of the population, started 28% of all companies. And this is a very positive story, right? There's a positive spin you could put on this, which is that people who are going to come here, are going to leave a country, go somewhere where they don't know anyone, are risk takers, right? More likely to start a business. That's the positive spin. The negative spin is if you don't speak the language and you don't have a cousin in the union and you don't have the social networks to get jobs, you often don't have another choice. And so as much as this looks like a positive story, I will submit it's balanced. But what it does mean is that there is a very positive thing happening when people are coming here, starting new businesses. And we have this reality in America that when 95% of the world lives outside our shores, it's our great competitive advantage that they want to come here. So the first thing is entrepreneurship, but not all immigrants are entrepreneurs. But I'll give a second one that's particularly relevant at a place like a university, which is that we want to out-innovate the world. And in a very global economy, that becomes more difficult. Do you want the cell phones to be made here by Apple, or do you want them to be made by a company in South Korea? Do you want planes that are flying around the world to be made by Boeing based in Washington, or do you want them by Airbus based in Europe? And there's a real innovation fight to get the top talent. If you go to the next slide. And immigration's not the panacea that's gonna cure us, but it is a huge boon in our innovation economy. So if you look at where early stage research is being done in a country, you look at the top patent producing universities in America, and 3 out of every 4 of their patents have an immigrant behind them. But the reality is we're sending a lot of those immigrants home. We have an immigration policy that doesn't let you stay after we've paid money to train you, even if you're innovating, where there simply aren't enough visas. So if you go to the next one. If you go to the next slide. One more, please. Yeah, keep go ahead again. There's no audio, so I won't show you the video. One more. Again. There you go. But of course, not all immigrants are high-skilled innovators, and not all immigrants are entrepreneurs. Most immigrants are low-skilled. And for a lot of Americans in a tough economy, it's really easy to say, well, why would we want low-skilled immigrants? But the reality of our economy is that there are a lot of reasons we do. We want a dynamic economy where we want people of all skill sets coming. And if you look at the clearest way to look at this is through the agriculture industry, but we can talk about a dozen other industries if it's helpful. We have a $100 billion agriculture industry in America. It supports a huge number of Americans up and downstream, whether they're managers or they're shippers or they're suppliers or you work in the port. The Port of Oakland, 40% of our exports are agriculture. So those jobs don't exist if we don't have an agriculture industry. But the truth of the matter is, in rural places where most of our farms are, where you have seasonal jobs that are very hard, very labor intensive, there simply isn't an American workforce to do that. So this is data from North Carolina in 2011. This is the height of the recession. There are 500,000 unemployed people in North Carolina. Every single one of them lives in or next to a county with 10% unemployment. And there are 6,500 what's called H-2A jobs. These are temporary seasonal agriculture jobs that need to be filled. And by law, you have to advertise in the newspaper, you have to go to your unemployment agencies. And a lot of Americans get referred. Only 268 Americans applied. 245 show up the first day. 245 are hired. Only about 2/3 of them show up the first day. Only 7 Americans make it the whole growing season. And this is in the height of the recession. And what's really interesting about the way North Carolina has data is that the North Carolina, they apply together, the farms apply together. So you have data that's longitudinal, so you can look not just every year, but you can look over a 10-year span. You say, when the economy's great or the economy's worse, how does that impact the amount of Americans willing to do this job? Right? If the economy's humming and everyone's got other options, maybe they don't want to do it. But in a recession, maybe they do. And the reality is there's absolutely no difference. Because this is hard work. And the reality of the great success story of American families of the last generation is that we're going to college. More of us are getting high school educated. And that's great for our individual families, but it means there are fewer and fewer people to do these industries. And we could decide we don't want an agriculture industry in America. But if we do, it is beneficial to have people who can fill in all these roles. Let's go to another one. I'll show you one more. One more. We're skipping that. All right. This is the fourth one, which is aging. We are getting older and getting older faster. There are 10,000 baby boomers retiring every single day. Now, immigrants are not going to stop that trend, and they're not going to replace it. They're a small number. But they certainly do mitigate it. Immigrants, if you go to the next slide, are far more likely to be working age because they're coming here. So you have 10,000 baby boomers retiring every day, and you think about all of that means for an economy, what it means for strains on healthcare, which I'll talk about next, what it means on housing. For most of your life, you are more likely to be a home buyer than a home seller. When you turn 65, you're now more likely to be a home seller. What does that do for most Americans when their net worth is tied up in their home, and all of a sudden you have 10,000 people a day moving into their selling category? Well, having young people who are coming here to work is actually really helpful for that. And I'll go to the last one, which is healthcare, if you go to the next slide. So immigrants pay far more into Social Security than they draw down. They also are much more likely in the healthcare industry to be, because immigrants are much more likely to be highly educated and much more likely to be lower educated. Americans congregate in the middle. That in the healthcare, it means that for both elder care, home health aides, but also for highly needed specialists, immigrants fill those roles. So if you think about this, and you understand this impact, and you start thinking about what immigration policy should be, there's some things that become relevant. Like, we should look at where do we need workers in the economy, what jobs, where in what regions, and we could design a policy that would be much better for American workers, that would be much better for American citizens, for our communities. But we don't have that. What we have is an immigration policy where work is an afterthought, where effectively we say we have the same number of workers coming in every single year, whether it's a boom time or a bust time. And that's a shame in the rest of the world, when the rest of the world is starting to make their immigration policy all about this. So that's our message. So we formed an organization to try and make this message. And we try and go to the next slide. One more. We try and take it out. So as an organization, we go all around the country. We start integration projects to the reddest parts of the country, to some of the cities all over, to try and take this message out. If you go one more, and we try and get it into the chattering class to influence the debate. And I think we've done a very good job of getting it out there, but what it does is, in some sense, it creates for all the gains you make in convincing people that immigration is an economic boon, there's a segment of America who finds that message threatening, that thinks, well, why do I need immigrants? What's wrong with us? Why aren't we training Americans? And the answer is, of course, we should be. And so what this leaves us now, if you go to the next slide, here's where we stand now. We have Americans who are increasingly convinced that immigration is a good thing. And despite the rhetoric coming out of the White House, I think that has helped convince people even more so. But we have a system where there are huge threats to immigrants, where we are more polarized than we've ever been, despite the fact that there's this growing middle, where you see it, and I'll let Katie talk about all the stuff the administration is doing, which is very scary in terms of every day, whether it's making sure immigrants don't have ability to understand their rights before they go into a hearing, or speeding up ways to deport them. But I submit to you, going back to the hope of optimism, that we are closer than ever to finding reform in Congress, to getting a system that takes the gains that John talked about from 1965 and says, it was a huge advance to benefit families. But in a modern economy, we need to think about a system that Americans can buy into, that helps our economy, that helps people too. Not at the expense of families. I think that's a hugely important part of what immigration is and who we are. But how do we have a modern system? And the reason I'm optimistic is When we started 8 years ago, when you walked the halls of Congress, there were very few people who, especially on the Republican side, who believed in this idea of comprehensive immigration reform, of securing the borders, of giving a legal path to stay here to undocumented immigrants, of modernizing our system. Now they all believe it as a policy matter, but they're scared as a political matter. And that's a fight you can win. I mean, that's a fight where, with enough pressure, you can get a debate. We're about to have a huge election that looks like it's going to be driven a huge amount by the immigration issue, among others. And we'll have a very new Congress and a big fight next year. And the fear is we'll do what we do every 3 years. We have a fight in Congress. It looks good. Maybe we get something through one house and then we lose. But we have an opportunity over the next 9 months to go out and push this message, to push your representatives. And you guys are in a hugely important place here, because you actually have a representative who is at the center of all of this. Representative Gottheimer chairs something called the Problem Solver Caucus. It represents Fairleigh Dickinson University. These are the few people in Congress who actually decide, despite everything else that's going on, we're going to get together with some Republicans and Democrats and try and take on the hard issues. So I will leave you in the realm of optimism with, here's my offer on how I think you can make a real difference. So if you go to the next slide. First is understanding how things matter hyper-locally. So we built something which we're very proud of. If you go to the next slide, it's called Map the Impact, where for every congressional district in the country, for the 100 largest cities and for all states, you can see how immigration impacts your own community. This is yours. This is your district, New Jersey 5. So here in this congressional districts, immigrants have $5 billion in spending power. They pay $2 billion in taxes. 6,000 of them own businesses. 70% of them are working age. Is understand why this matters and then get vocal. It's very easy to seem like one voice doesn't matter, but the most amazing thing when you're walking the halls of Congress is how much every phone call matters, how much every meeting matters. Because especially now that congressmen hold very few town halls, they actually don't know how their constituents have, and they're afraid of constituents. And so the more that people are vocal, every citizen, and I'll leave you with one more tool which I think is very helpful beyond Map the Impact, which is something we built called Reason for Reform. So you all have cell phones. If you go to reasonforreform.org, we built a tool where you can record a video that says, here's my story, here's why I want immigration reform, here's why it's important to my community, and it automatically gets sent to your representatives. And every one of those matters. Every time they get a video from someone saying, this is why that matters locally. And with that, my reason for optimism is we will win. It is the right issue. Americans are increasingly believing in it. I think the demographics, as John showed about the trends of where immigrants are, when immigrants used to just be in cities, and there's a smaller number of them, and when they were cut off after the 24 Act, and it went down to about 5% of the population in 1970, it was easy to stoke the fears. But now you have a world where immigrants are basically everywhere. They're not just in New York and LA, San Francisco, Chicago. Immigrants are in every state. And I think the initial clash when that happens is really scary. Because if you take places that are very homogeneous and then immigrants move in, that's where you get a big reactionary pushback. But then you look 10 years down the line, and those are the places that become tolerant. So I'll stop there for questions, but I will say this is a very important moment in this debate. It's the hardest moment we've seen, I think, in immigration in a long time, but I think we are closer than we've ever been to actually getting sensible reform passed. I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, and thank you, John, and thank you, Rhoda, and thank you to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. My name is Katie Reisner, and as was said before, I'm a senior policy advisor to the Commissioner for Immigrant Affairs for Mayor de Blasio in New York City. But as a note, I'm here in my personal capacity, not my official capacity. And so I kind of feel like two very hard acts to follow. And I also sort of feel like perhaps Jeremy should have gone after me, because I'm going to I thought that perhaps what might be useful to folks is just a really kind of a detailed picture of what has gone on during the course of this presidency, because immigration has been the centerpiece of this presidency in a way that I think Maybe John can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in a way that we really haven't seen in quite a while, the extent to which immigration is really such a centerpiece of the domestic agenda. And so I just thought I might be helpful by sort of laying out the many different ways in which the immigration agenda is being effectuated, and helping to perhaps get beneath some of the headlines that have been out there. Some background on me. I went to law school, as many people do, without really kind of having a sense of what I would do. I had just had sort of a sense that I wanted to serve the public in some way. I had a background in international relations, and I by chance, there were a group of immigration scholars who were at my law school at the time, and I realized that the immigration arena was this sort of fascinating area of law, because there are these big unanswered questions that, as John's presentation showed, that we've continued to wrestle with throughout our history. There isn't actually a place in the Constitution that gives the power to regulate immigration expressly to anyone. It had to be read into the Constitution for a lot of the same dynamic reasons that John laid out so well, because the notion of sovereignty, of nationhood, was changing. And so I saw immigration as a way to both kind of alleviate human suffering at the individual level and address, kind of really interesting, complex policy issues. Before I was at the mayor's office, I was in the Obama administration at the Department of Homeland Security, where I was able to work on refugee and immigration policy from that vantage point. And after that, I was able to work for Senator Kamala Harris to stand up her DHS oversight and immigration portfolio. So again, I'm not here in my official capacity, but just as someone who has been thinking about these questions for a long time from a bunch of different vantage points. As John very helpfully laid out, you can kind of think about a lot of the many decisions that go on in immigration in terms of what's going on in terms of who we are letting in terms of admissions, and what's going on in terms of how we're regulating who's here and how we're regulating who has to go. So kind of the admissions angle of things and the enforcement side of things. And in the year and several months since President Trump came into office, we've seen dramatic changes on both of those fronts. Things that don't need an act of Congress, things that can be effectuated completely through the executive branch. And these are things that really don't reflect the center of they don't really reflect the mainstream, the middle. They are born of ideas that really represent the extremities of the Republican Party. And just by way of illustration, I just wanted to read a quote and see if anyone could guess kind of whose it was. Our nation is a nation of immigrants. More than any other country, our strength comes from our own immigrant heritage and our capacity to welcome those from other lands. So it's a president, but I'm just wondering if anyone had a thought on who that would be. It was not JFK. Anyone have another guess? I'm hearing FDR, George Washington. So Trump. Very wide range of answers. That was actually President Reagan in 1981. That was it was again when he signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act 1986. That was one of the principles underlying it. Yes, it was about securing the border, but it was also about a deep recognition that we are a nation of immigrants. So that's just sort of to level set kind of where things are right now. They are very far from what had been bedrock sort of consensus Republican views on immigration. As soon as the president entered office on January 20th, and that just in the 7 days that followed, we got many executive orders. One concerning the border enforcement, one concerning interior enforcement, meaning immigration enforcement inside the country, away from the border. And then, of course, the travel ban. And so I assume that most folks are pretty familiar with a travel ban. I won't go into it in too much depth. But it should be noted that it'll be getting argued before the Supreme Court on April 25th. And the court will be considering the statute, whether the travel ban is lawful as a matter of statute, whether it's lawful under the Immigration and Nationality Act, and also whether it is lawful under the Constitution, so whether it's a violation of the Establishment Clause. And we can probably expect a decision sometime before the court closes its session at the end of June. There has also been, of course, a lot of talk about sanctuary cities. And as a resident of New York City, there's, and I know that this is the term that a lot of folks have trouble sort of, what does it mean? And so I want to sort of offer some comfort if you've been sort of confused about what this thing means. It doesn't have a consistent definition. And actually, folks who are sort of proponents of policies that are generally considered to be under the umbrella of sanctuary cities do not use the term because it has now been effectively kind of co-opted by folks who don't want to see these policies effectuated. So what are the policies that really constitute a jurisdiction as one? And people refer to them as welcoming cities or safe cities. In general terms, it means that the jurisdiction, and that could be a county or a city or a state, has committed to not cooperate with immigration law enforcement in some way. They want the big idea is that they want their own local law enforcement to be serving public safety aims, public safety goals of that locality. And the idea is that in a diverse community where people live in what are called mixed status homes, mixed status households. Maybe someone does not have lawful status, but there are folks who were born in the United States and are therefore citizens. We don't want to be tearing communities apart. We want everyone who resides within our jurisdiction to feel equally safe to report crime, to access public services, to get public health services, to send their kids to school, to participate civically. And that is the big thesis for jurisdictions that kind of think of themselves as welcoming jurisdictions. And they have a lot of kind of variation. So in New York City, there are our NYPD does not cooperate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, except in cases where where the city believes that there is a public safety or national security threat, and the city makes its own decision. It's a very small number of individuals. In jurisdictions that there are many jurisdictions that go the opposite way and do enter into agreements with immigration enforcement authorities to actively cooperate. So these are jurisdictions that enter into what are called 287G agreements, referencing the statute under which this authority exists. And and local law enforcement effectively become sort of an arm of immigration enforcement. So the two are intertwined. And so there's a huge diversity in policies at the state, local level. And so when we have kind of heard this administration really attack sanctuary cities, what they're referring to are cities that really refuse to cooperate in various forms with federal immigration authorities. So what has happened over the course of 2017 is that the sort of the front line of this debate, of this fight, is over federal funding. So the U.S. Department of Justice decided that these huge grants that are actually public safety funds designed to go to policing and 911 dispatchers and all sorts of other public safety funds that have nothing to do with immigration, really. The Department of Justice has decided to attach conditions to them that require jurisdictions to cooperate on immigration enforcement. And this is very problematic for jurisdictions like New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago or Los Angeles or the state of California. don't believe that that's really within their mission set to conduct immigration enforcement. So there are multiple lawsuits ongoing over these additional conditions on massive amounts of federal funding. There was actually just a decision today out of Chicago, out of the appellate court in the Seventh Circuit. 3 judges appointed by Republican presidents agreed that it was unlawful to attach certain conditions related to immigration cooperation to these major federal grants. So this is going to be a really live issue that's going to be ongoing for the remainder of this, certainly of this presidency, but I think it's something that we can expect to see moving forward during our lifetimes, this question of what amount of immigration enforcement belongs at the local and state level and what really ought to stay at the federal level. The thing, though, is that this administration also does not represent just a very aggressive posture on removing people from the country who may lack status or have become deportable. There are peppered throughout this administration are people who really have extreme views on they really seek to limit the total number of lawful immigrants to the country as well. And we've seen this play out in a number of ways. There was the introduction of a bill by Senator Tom Cotton and Senator Perdue over the course of the summer called the RAISE Act. And this is a bill that would, in not that long, it would reduce that family migration that we heard about that started in 1965. It would reduce that by over half. So family migration comprises about 65% of lawful immigration to the United States every year. And this bill would reduce that by half. And it was in a very rare move. The White House actually endorsed the RAISE Act as official White House policy. That's not very common for any White House to do, to endorse a particular bill, but that's what this White House did. And so what the bill really was seeking to accomplish was just reducing overall lawful immigration to the country. And so we have seen the sort of this immigration agenda also play out to attacks on other people who are otherwise have some lawful status here. So of course, the Dreamers were mentioned earlier in the introductory remarks. This has been it's incredible how much this issue, the profile of this issue, has risen in just the past 18 months or so. Dreamers first became sort of an idiom after 2001 when Senator Dick Durbin introduced the DREAM Act, addressing a long-standing problem of, okay, so we understand that we have all these folks who come here without status, or they come here lawfully with a visa and overstay. And then so there's these group of kids who grow up and they learn that they lack immigration status. They don't know, perhaps, or they were so young when they came here. There's this notion that there's no fault, that they're not at fault for having violated any immigration law. They came here with their family, and unbeknownst to them, they are now out of status. But they're eager to learn, to work, to enter the military. What do we do with this population? So it was in 2001 that Senator Durbin introduced the first bill to provide a pathway to citizenship for this special population of subpopulation of undocumented immigrants. As Jeremy said, every 3 to 4 years we see some noise around immigration reform, and the Dreamers enter into comprehensive immigration reform debates. It's a huge piece of the puzzle when you're thinking about how to reform the immigration system. When the Obama administration created DACA in 2012, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, as a way of effectuating through executive means what had not yet been accomplished through Congress. Through the executive branch, you don't have the power to actually put someone on a pathway to citizenship, But the big idea there was we have limited means with which to conduct immigration enforcement. You saw on John's chart the huge number of deportations that were going on during the Obama administration. But those were increasingly prioritized by people deemed to be public safety threats, so people who had actual criminal convictions. And so the idea was, if we live in a universe of limited enforcement resources, we want to prioritize some people for removal from the country, but we want to deprioritize other people and just take them off the table and enable them to just kind of live their lives. And so the DACA recipients became, were that population at first in 2012. And so DACA recipients have to submit to background checks and have to prove all of these different qualifications to show that they're on the education track or the military track or the work track. They have to resubmit all of their identifying information and all of their biometrics every 2 years. And if they stray from the course, if they conduct some sort of criminal activity, then they lose their very precious protection from deportation and work authorization. And so over the course of the program, 800,000 or so young immigrants have been granted DACA at one time or another. And so it really hung in the balance when President Trump was elected. And it was one of the things that President Obama impressed upon President Trump. But when they met as the transition of power was going on, it was really to protect the dreamers, protect the DACA recipients. And so we saw over the course of the summer a lead up to September 5th, when President Trump then rescinded the DACA program with a 6-month wind down. The idea being that Congress would then have to act to pass the legislation to provide some sort of statutory protection to DACA recipients. And there was a great deal of campaigning and advocacy that was going on, and people like the New American Economy were producing such helpful statistics, and there was a huge amount of energy going on with each successive sort of deadline by which Congress was going to try to get a piece of legislation passed. And then, of course, the deadline that the president had set for DACA legislation came and went. That was March 6th of this year. And in the meantime, the Trump administration has been sued by multiple parties over the rescission of the DACA policy. The basic claim is that the rescission didn't occur in the right way on kind of procedural grounds, and then there are also claims that it violates the equal protection provisions of the Constitution, that it's it's inherently discriminatory. So some of those lawsuits have resulted in a preliminary injunction, which now is enabling existing DACA recipients to renew their status. So it's something that folks are generally encouraged to do if they can, but that too has sort of taken some of the pressure off of Congress to get something passed statutorily. And just for, to kind of bring it closer to home, there are an estimated 30,000 DACA recipients in New York City. And they contribute $4.7 billion to New York City's gross domestic product. So it's a huge issue for New York City. The DREAM Act itself, which is still alive in Congress and is again being championed by Senator Durbin and along with Republican Senator Graham. That would actually, because it has a bit wider aperture, it would protect an estimated 150,000 New Yorkers. So this stands to enable many more New Yorkers to work in the lawful economy and contribute a great deal more to our economy. What we saw during the DACA debate was also the Trump administration's introduction of its 4 pillars. And here, too, is where we saw some of the attacks on the family-based migration system. So it's been sort of, the Trump administration has called it chain migration. And they sort of invoke this image that one immigrant who comes here can bring an indefinite number of very distant relatives to the country. And that is not true. That is not the way that it works. There are a limited number of categories, and really the only relationships that the Immigration and Nationality Act recognizes are nuclear family relationships. So it's either it's someone it's your spouse, parent, child. That's it. Brothers and sisters as well, in some categories, very limited. But there's no, you can't sponsor your grandmother to come, for example. You can't sponsor your niece to come. You can't sponsor your cousin to come. Anything beyond the nuclear family is not recognized under the family reunification provisions of the INA. And beyond that, there are visa caps on different countries. So for some people who apply for family reunification visas, their wait times can be decades long, actually. So an individual who comes to the United States, yes, they can sponsor other family members, but those family members are limited in terms of how close a relation they have to be. And those spots are limited in availability because of the visa caps and the wait times. So the notion that there's some sort of this lengthy chain that's sort of crisscrossing the Atlantic and the Pacific is really, really not how this program works in effect. So it's unfortunate that there's just a lot of, I think, public education to be done around this topic. There's a void there. On the enforcement side of things, the way we have in the Obama administration, there were record levels of deportations, as John pointed out. But as I mentioned before, that was based on a system there was a priority system. And the idea, as I mentioned before, is that we were going to use limited enforcement resources to really only prioritize people who had demonstrated that maybe they were going to be some concern to public safety. So there were a few different priority categories. And by the end of the Obama administration, over 90-some-odd% of deportations fell into one of these categories. And you hear this administration, President Trump, talking about the impressive enforcement accomplishments of his immigration enforcement apparatus. But when you look at the numbers, the way that they are getting such high numbers of arrests and is by not having any prioritization system really at all. The number of non-criminal arrests has just skyrocketed since the Obama administration. In parts of New York City, it's gone up by 200%. And so the administration, when they release a press release about an enforcement operation in so-and-so county or wherever, they will highlight the folks who they did arrest who had scary-sounding convictions, but they'll refer to the rest of the folks as they were collateral convictions. And what that means is they were going into people's homes, they were going into public places, and then if someone else on the scene appeared to perhaps be an immigrant, they would also check them out, and that becomes a collateral arrest, someone who's perhaps just here but lacks proper documentation. So the enforcement agenda is really just there's really no sense of let's use our limited enforcement resources to prioritize people in any way. It's really I think it can be properly called a dragnet. And there are also things that are really important to pay attention to in the way in which access to justice and due process are being changed by this administration. So on April 10th, news broke that the Department of Justice was planning to terminate something called the Legal Orientation Program and the Immigration Court Help Desk. These are programs that help educate immigrants in detention about their rights. So most folks in detention don't actually get represented by an attorney. But statistics show that if you are represented by an attorney, astonishingly, your chances of obtaining immigration relief are much higher. Immigration law, even for lawyers, is a very tricky and sort of very complicated area to know, and people have to be expert in kind of even subcategories of immigration law. So you can imagine the near impossibility of someone sort of representing themselves to the fullest extent possible. So the legal orientation program is something that it wasn't available to everyone. It was available to a small number of people, but it was at least something to give folks who were perhaps going to have to represent themselves some understanding of what system they found themselves within. And that has been, the announcement was that this will be suspended to assess its efficacy. But that's being interpreted to be really an indefinite suspension of this program. So one of the few ways in which many people who are detained are able to access some kind of legal information is also being taken away. Another element of the kind of another way in which access to justice, access to due process is being limited is by the Department of Justice announcement that they are going to put quotas on immigration judges. And this is a problem for many reasons. So the backlogs in immigration courts are a huge problem. They are really long, and these courts are really stretched to the limits. The answer that many people have to that problem, though, is that it's one of resourcing. It's getting additional immigration judges to be able to process these cases. To say nothing of the fact that if many of these folks had representation, they might actually go faster. But it's not really diagnosed by many people as a problem of judges simply not getting through enough cases. The reality is that some cases just take a long time, particularly a complicated asylum claim where someone has to make a lot of showings in order to be granted relief. So the concern is that by sort of arbitrarily assigning a quota of cases that each immigration judge has to get through in order to meet basic performance requirements is going to force judges to really just churn out decisions in the interests of time rather than in the interests of assuring that someone received due process. And then finally, I wanted to talk about two things that are very current. One is the census for 2020. So one of John's slides went up to 2010 about in terms of the number of the foreign born. The reason that it only went up to 2010 is because that number is collected in the decennial census. So the census for 2020 it seems like perhaps far away, but in terms of how much has to get done to prepare and launch the census, it's actually pretty close. And it is not. It's not a unique thing for the census to get politicized. It's regularly politicized because so much hinges on it. So, of course, congressional redistricting hinges on the decennial census. The census is also called for in the Constitution. It's a constitutional obligation to count every single person in the United States. But many, many other things flow from the count. So federal funding, other research hinges on the decennial census to make further estimates about other things, other projections. So the implications for this thing are just so huge, and people are aware of this, and it's been used and sort of weaponized in the past. And so I'm sure many folks in the audience heard when there was a decision made to add a question about citizenship to the census. A question about citizenship has not been asked on the census since 1950. Obviously, the context now is very different. So there were two problems with this. One is that this census has been dramatically underfunded because of the sequester back in 2012, 2013. And so the preparations that would usually be going into this massive nationwide effort had to be cut short. So in just one example, they usually do 3 what are called end-to-end tests. These tests where they roll out the whole thing and see how it goes so they can learn and make it work better in the actual census count. Now they're doing one. They're doing one of these tests. And the request for this addition of the citizenship question came after that one test was already underway. So if there are any folks with a data background here, you'll know that it's a huge problem. Just the framing of one question can change the outcome dramatically. And so from just a procedural perspective, the addition of a question at this point in time, when there are like 18 months to go, 2 years to go before the actual census count, is really irresponsible by just sort of professional standards. So that's kind of number one. And by the way, this is the constitutional obligation to get everyone counted. And then number two, of course, in the current environment, the Census Bureau's own studies had already shown that there's such a heightened fear among not just immigrant communities, but really minority communities generally. U.S. citizen, Arab American homes, for example, other minority communities who are still U.S. citizens. When census workers would come to do surveys in preparation for the 2020 census, they found that homes of Arab Americans and other minorities just did not want to engage in the survey process with the census worker. They detected a huge amount of fear. And you might be able to sort of empathize with not really, someone's coming up from the U.S. government to your door, and meanwhile, you've been told by the ACLU that you shouldn't open your door if it's the federal government coming. You have rights, you have the Fourth Amendment, you can ask for a warrant, all these things, and you might empathize with someone who is having a hard time, who isn't really inclined to open their door to someone who identifies themselves as being with the U.S. government. So the Census Bureau folks knew this already, and so the addition of a question, particularly about citizenship, it is very widely believed that it's just going to suppress the count. And so immigrants are, both undocumented and documented, are considered a hard-to-count population. New York City, by the last census count, has 3.1 million foreign-born individuals, or 38% of the city. So you can imagine that for a city like New York, the immigrant count has everything to do with the total count. For redistricting purposes, it's estimated that an undercount by as little as 50,000 would cost New York State an additional seat in Congress. So New York State is already slated to lose 1 seat just by population shifts, but the census will determine whether New York State loses 2 seats. The politicization of the census is something that we're going to see continue, and there will be, I think we can expect to see other campaigns to suppress the count, but just another kind of uncommon channel in which sort of immigration, the immigration agenda is also moving forward. And then I'll close with mentioning something that is a bit technical, but I hope you will pay attention to as it comes up. And it's something called, it's a regulation concerning a very old provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act called the public charge. And so this is a term that was introduced in the Immigration and Nationality Act a long time ago, back when, as John described, the country was first starting to restrict who could come to the United States and who had to leave the United States. And the idea was, if someone is going to be a burden on society, if someone's going to be entirely dependent on the public for the entirety of their income, or is going to be in an institution of some kind, then they ought to be removed from the country. And so it was in the 90s. It was officially interpreted to be just those two narrow circumstances. Someone is a public charge; they cannot become a green card holder if they are if they rely on the government for cash assistance for 100% of their income, or they are institutionalized in some sort of long-term care facility. That was it. What is happening now, really as we speak, is that the Office of Management and Budget is reviewing a regulation by the Department of Homeland Security that kind of seeks to just kind of blow the doors off that definition of what a public charge is. So a draft of this regulation has leaked, and that regulation says that someone who is lawfully here cannot adjust for a green card status if they've used one public benefit, or if their U.S. citizen child has used just one public benefit. And there are limitations around these things, but public benefits do include Medicaid. So if your U.S. citizen child used Medicaid, that is imputed to you as you are then the public charge. If you're here as a visa holder, for example, but your U.S. citizen child used Medicaid, that'll be imputed to you, and you'll be deportable as a public charge. It also includes food stamps. So if your U.S. citizen child needed food stamps, then the non-citizen parent would be deportable as a public charge. And many, many other benefits, to include heating assistance and lots of other programs that communities rely upon to kind of keep the public healthy and educated and working. And so that is something that is going to take a long time to be finally published and effectuated. I think we can anticipate a lot of litigation over this. But that is also something that happens through these kind of channels of the executive branch that aren't always so visible. And so as stewards of responsible public policy, I just wanted to bring that to your attention, keep track of this issue, the public charge issue. And this too is something that you can speak to, you can share your opinion about with members of Congress, and make let other people know about this issue coming up. So hopefully I haven't depressed everyone too much, but but thank you very much, and I'll look forward to questions.
So Rhoda, how many minutes did you want to come talk? And okay. Mm-hmm. And how many minutes of questions do we have, would you say? Okay, sure. She'll scream if it runs too late. Okay, so I'm guessing there's gonna be a lot of questions. So I'll try to stack the best I can based on who goes first. Sorry, I saw like 3 hands go up first. But the woman in the corner with the blue scarf, and then I saw you in the middle, and then you back there with the green, right? Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, this question is primarily for Jeremy. First off, thank you all, because your presentations were marvelous. But the question for Jeremy, yes, I agree. Question for Jeremy is there another country that you might suggest we try to emulate their policies on immigration?
That's a great question, and thank you for that. And there's a lot. Let me start by saying there's a lot that we do poorly, but there's a lot that we do well too. I mean, we let in more immigrants as a absolute number than anywhere else on earth. We don't as a per capita number, and we don't for our size. And so to your question, yeah, President Trump always says we should be more like Canada. Canada has a merit system. We should be more like Canada. I actually think he's probably right. I think he just has no idea what Canada's like. So Canada does admit a huge number more high-skilled immigrants. They also admit just as many family immigrants. And when you actually look at how they think about their system, like merit means a lot of things. When the president says merit, it means essentially let's get rid of families. Or it means let's get rid of low-skilled immigrants. That's not what Canada means, right? Canada means let's think about merit in a whole bunch of different ways. So they have family. They have a huge number more immigrants. They give some regional control so that some regions can say, hey, you know what? In Alberta, we need oil workers. In Quebec, we need something else. And so I don't think Canada does it perfectly either, but they certainly actually, they have a lot of, more than we do, of even like the brain surgeon taxi driver problem of you let in a lot of smart people, but there might not be the right jobs or in the right place. But I think the orientation of having a system that says, look, there are a lot of reasons people want to come here, and we should try and catch them, with an emphasis on saying, look, there are a lot, we should say, if we know someone has talent, let's grab them, let's grab that talent. But also recognizing that a lot of the greatness that came from immigration isn't because we got like a scientist who speaks English already. It's because we got someone who wanted to work hard and make a better life, maybe had no formal education, maybe didn't speak English, but worked hard. And so yeah, I think we have a lot to learn from a lot of different countries. I think specifically on some of the things I mentioned about entrepreneurs, there's no visa to come to America and start a company. Like, that's crazy. If someone wants to come to America and they have some money invested, they got an idea, they're gonna start a company, they've already hired people, like, we shouldn't be turning them away. There are probably about a dozen countries that now have a startup visa, including Canada. When we train someone in our universities in fields that we know we need, there should be a way to stay. And for a lot of people, there aren't. Whereas again, like Canada, Canada put up a billboard in Silicon Valley which literally said, having trouble getting your H-1B, your high-skilled visa? Come to Canada, you'll have it in weeks. The ad wasn't like, come to Canada, our economy's so great, or come to Canada, we have these great jobs, or it was literally just like, your immigration system's really hard here, like, we'll take you. That's a problem for us.
In the middle.
Hi, this one's for Katie. So I had a question about the due process that you were talking about for immigrants. Is there any fight against the policies that are being put in place to kind of continue to prevent them for having due process, as well as, like, in addition to that quota that you were talking about? Is there anything that's fighting against that now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a lot of places that have sort of taken on a much heightened responsibility for trying to mitigate some of what's going on in the current enforcement and immigration legal environment. So many cities have launched or have dramatically increased their immigration legal assistance programs. So in New York City, for example, the city made an historic investment in immigration legal representation. $31 million were invested in the last fiscal year. And this has resulted in 80% of the immigrants, as of February of this year, 80% of immigrants who were in immigration and deportation proceedings in New York City were represented. And that's huge. This has dramatic, as I mentioned, this has huge results in terms of what the actual outcomes are. Many other cities also have their own immigrant legal defense funds. So Los Angeles has a large one, San Francisco, Chicago. And so I should mention, though, that the underrepresentation of immigrants in immigration proceedings is not a problem that originated in the Trump era. It's been a huge problem for a long time. And so in some sense, there's perhaps a silver lining in the sense that people are really waking up to the need for representation in immigration court.
And I wanted to say in New Jersey, I believe, in this most recent budget, there is, I think, 2-point-something million that is being allocated for immigration defense. It's just a starter, which New York City did do, and as you're seeing, it grew since then.
I just add one quick thing to that about the lack of representation, which is that coming here illegally is not a crime in the sense of you've committed a crime. right? You haven't robbed someone. It's a civil offense, and that sounds like a lawyer small distinction that doesn't actually matter, but it does matter, and because it's used against immigrants in a couple of different ways. They are treated as if it is a crime when they're called illegal, and the way that they are approached by the administration. But you actually have a right to counsel in a criminal trial, and so for the purpose of giving them counsel, they're treated as if it's not. And so you have this regime that is throwing them increasingly into detention centers, and all of the rights that would go around that when you're going to put someone in prison, and increasingly we are putting them in prison without any of the representation. And this is for people who actually, if you're not from here, have far less ability to defend themselves on their own than the typical American citizen would, who understands our legal system.
Yes, in the green.
If you were asked to design your immigration system, what would it look like? All of you.
You go ahead. I gotta think about that.
I have a lot of thoughts on how to do that. I mean, I think there are several goals for why we let people come here, and I think we should focus on a lot of them in different ways. One of them, which we haven't talked about today, because it's a little distinct from immigration, but it is very similar, is about refugees, right? We just shot missiles at Syria, and we have a Middle East policy about that. Like, I would have a policy that would be more welcoming to refugees. Refugees have been something that's been good for our society. Refugees have a history of doing very well in the United States, and in a huge global refugee crisis, I think it's irresponsible to have that. For an immigration system, I would have one that looks at family reunification, that I think is a really important thing. I think we want to continue, but is much more heavily weighted as well towards workers. We are at historic highs at about 14%, closing on 15% of immigrants. But there's no reason why that, I mean, and that makes some people nervous. Oh, we're at historic highs, we should stop. Well, I'm not quite sure why. Canada has about double the number of immigrants that we do per capita and is doing very well. I mean, the notion that certainly we want to look at a system that there is some limit where we don't want to have open borders, and I think when immigrants come, people say they're not competing against Americans. Well, it's true, immigrants tend to have different skill sets and fill different roles, but of course there's some competition against some set of Americans, and the more immigrants you let in, there's going to be more of that. So I would want a system that looks at that says, all right, well, where do we need workers? What impact is immigration having on American workers? Is this helping us have a more dynamic economy or not? And you can do that a bunch of different ways. You can do that with a market-driven approach that looks at how people are. If you have visas and all of a sudden they're used up in one day, maybe you need more next year. If they're not, you need fewer. You could do it with an approach where you have some economists. You have an advisor of economists trying to project. I think that is a little bit trickier just based on the way government works. I think we should have a startup visa for entrepreneurs, like I said. I think we should have a functioning guest worker program where right now the reality is there are a lot of industries that simply would not exist or if we don't actually fix that system.
And we had a history of that. I mean, the Bracero program was World War II. I mean, during a time of crisis, the U.S. is able to invent, policies. Out of World War II, we had some of the, I mean, if you look at the kind of policies around immigration and refugees, we had some of the most, I think some of the most clairvoyant policies we had, and we've kind of backed away from that. I mean, the way the post-World War II generation handled refugees and connected it to American prestige, giving a way for people from Hungary, the communist bloc, to come to the United States, from Cuba. People were afraid of Cubans. This is like something I write about in research. People, if you go back to the 1960s, people were afraid of Cubans. What if a communist gets through? And there were 100,000 Cubans that came within 3 years of the revolution. And when you read, JFK, Kennedy, sort of think through what the United States will get versus what it will lose by accepting large numbers of people that are in need. The value's beyond economic, right? You have political capital in the world, and this is something that's particularly on the matter of refugees. When you look at the last 70 years, that we've lost side of that. But the guest worker program, we have a history of that. The Bracero program was a World War II era program, lasted from 1942 to 1964. 4.5 million Mexican nationals came to the United States at that time to work primarily in agriculture, to produce, goods for the war, as Americans were serving in the war. So then, they were promptly deported, and with them some of their children who were American citizens. There's, incredible writing on the Bracero program. Not all of it's happy. In fact, a lot of it's sad. But there is a history of that, and I think that, keeping that in mind, you don't see that discourse at all here. It's all about threat and what we're losing and who could come in and blow up a town, and that there's a limit to that. And other countries are going to fill the void, like Germany and others that have a much more liberal policy.
I'll just add two things. One is that I think any immigration system ought to kind of responsibly acknowledge that there are going to be people who come in through informal channels. There is always, as soon as you create a legal system for immigration, you also create an undocumented population, as John described through his history. And so the present state of affairs, where we have between 11 and 12 million people who lack documentation, who, for the vast majority of whom are not public safety threats, what do you do to responsibly give that population a way to enter into the formal society? Otherwise, we are a society that has a second class, a caste system. So this is a problem that Reagan tried to address when he granted asylum to a massive number of people in the 80s, and it was understanding some of these key principles that we don't want to create a caste system in the United States. But for any time you create a legal category, you also create kind of the negative space of that, you create an undocumented category. So I think a forward-looking immigration system would find a way to, without creating a pull factor, would create a way to, at regular intervals, enable people to get on a pathway to citizenship. And by the way, when people refer to a pathway to citizenship, these are often, in these proposed bills, very lengthy, arduous processes where people have to subject themselves to intense background checks and biometric screening, and it can be as long as 10 years in some of the proposals that we've seen recently, as long as 15 years. So putting someone on a pathway to citizenship is not a golden ticket by any means. It's a lot of hard work and persistence. But I think that a responsible system would acknowledge that that will just be a reality moving forward. And do we want to be a society that just willfully creates a lower caste? And then I would just also add a note that to some of Jeremy's points about just increasing retaining what we have in terms of family-based migration, but then increasing the numbers of people we have coming in based on economic needs. The notion that there is some upper threshold beyond which our economy cannot tolerate additional immigrants to the country is a totally false notion. There's no testing on it. There's no evidence to suggest that we know what that upper threshold would be. So the current immigration levels are actually more a reflection of what the current bureaucracy can process, right? So it's how many person hours in the federal government are there to process visa applications and conduct background checks and conduct interviews and that sort of thing. So I would just say that we haven't even kind of taken this global economy out for a spin yet. We haven't. It really hasn't been tested.
Of the sort of 100% of people who do come and are undocumented, what percent of them overstay visas versus walk across the border or come in by some other method?
It's a great question. We don't actually fully know. The estimates I've seen are 40% overstay their visas. But the reality is it's very hard to study the undocumented for a lot of the reasons that Katie suggested. Right? People don't want to They don't want to answer a census. They don't want to put up their hands, and actually for really good reasons. I mean, one of the, going to John's history, I mean, when we interned the Japanese, a lot of the ways we found them was from census data, like people who had given their information to the census that was misused. And I don't think there's so much historical memory necessarily there, but there's this idea that there is this history. And so it's hard. But the best estimates I've seen are 40% are overstayed their visa. I don't know if you've seen it.
Hi. Either John or Jeremy talked about millennials and their ability to accept a more diverse society. And from what little I've heard about what's going on in the elementary school, diversity is celebrated, I mean, really celebrated. And it makes me wonder whether it's policies driving attitudes or attitudes driving policy, or they both have to be working at the same time. So what experience do you have? You know, we talked about that middle group that nobody really is listening to, about using the fact that eventually it's just going to happen. People are just going to accept it. What do you think?
Well, I can tell. I mean, just working with college students, I'm always just blown away by how engaged they are. I mean, this is historically, a constituency that most politicians don't talk to because they just don't vote. And I think that's changing. I think that's changing with social media. I think even the midterms, or certainly the 2020 election, might show a much larger showing among 18 to 24-year-olds. It definitely is a disconnect between the discourse coming out of Washington, D.C. and sort of how, especially New Jersey students, sort of see their lives. And it's not just immigration. It's a variety of issues. I mean, when we talk about LGBT rights, I'm a kid from the 80s and 80s and 90s, so I'm kind of looking at them with how I sort of was raised with that and learned about it, and they're just thinking and processing and comfortable with conversations that, my professors and teachers never would have had, at that time. So there's definitely a generational gap. I think what they're trying to wrap their minds around is really how do you have sustainable answers to these questions? I mean, what are the limits, for instance, of executive power in forming immigration policy, right? I mean, every 4 years or every 8 years, we get a new administration, and there's a lot of discretionary control. And to be sustainable, there needs to be congressional action, and I think that's where they're sort of thinking about how do you transmit ideas and ideology into action. I think the Never Again, the gun violence, the gun control march among young people is also in that same vein. We've got these ideas and attitudes, and now it's about how to make them actionable into policy and how to get your mind around that.
Well, I guess you can go, then you can go. Is that all right? Okay.
Hi, it's more of a statement, not so much a question, but I think it's important to say, can you hear me? Okay. I like the conversation about immigration reform. I think it's a great conversation. But the reality is that immigration, especially from poor, less educated, and less skilled workers, is never going to make up for the many more who are left behind, due in part to United States involvement in Latin American politics. So it's great to talk about once they're here, what do we do with the few of them? I think the larger conversation is what happens or what should happen with those who are left behind, because there's too many of them. And I don't believe the solution is to open up your borders to let everybody in. I don't think no country is capable of doing that. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to make sure their involvement in policies of politics and economics and so on in those countries, it does not always benefit us, because it's basically at the expense of those that we are who we are. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. Not only talk about those who are here, but also those who are left behind.
Well, I think you raised an important point, which is that it's the local conditions in a lot of the countries that people are fleeing from for different reasons, whether it's persecution or an unstable economy or a very violent country. Those conditions are they're referred to as the push factors. And so a huge part of the United States' ability to conduct immigration policy effectively and border security hinges on relationships with those countries. And a lot of, during my time at the Department of Homeland Security, I saw a lot of this up close. And I saw the extent to which the Department of Homeland Security was really liaising very closely with the governments of throughout Latin America. They were some of the most important relationships. A former colleague of mine used to say that the worst place to conduct border security is at the border. You want to be working with folks in Mexico to work on flows of people, and you want to be working with El Salvador to try to address some of the pervasive conditions there. You want to be helping Haiti rebuild after the earthquake so that that people don't need to be fleeing the country. And in the refugee space as well, that there's the same notion. Refugee resettlement is considered the least best option by the United Nations. The United Nations regards people's in the best case scenario, someone would be able to go home, and that's what the world community should be really helping to effectuate. But there are just situations that don't permit that, right? Syria is not a place that anyone's going to be able to go home to anytime soon. So part of what, for me personally, is difficult to see in this administration is all of that work that I saw happening at the Department of Homeland Security when I was there, to work very closely with in a variety of ways throughout Latin America in particular, seeing some of those relationships kind of go a different direction, just because of what I saw as really important bilateral relationships for exactly the reasons you discussed.
So we're actually out of time, but I'll just get one more question, and then it will be. And I don't know if the panelists might have to leave. So, but if they are around, maybe you could ask more. But I don't want to promise anything.
For Jeremy, I like the new American economy idea. Do you have any brilliant ways to convince our supposedly business-oriented government that instead of bashing immigrants, we should realize that they're good for the country and unite us more instead of doing the divisive things they've been doing? It's like it's good for the economy, not bad.
Look, I'll say this. I mean, I think the economic arguments are extremely valuable in this debate. I mean, I obviously believe in it. That's why I work where I work. But I think they're one tool in a larger tool belt. I think someone who is putting our current national government aside for a second, I think someone who is extremely anti-immigrant, often for cultural reasons, is not going to become a yes because of the economic arguments. I think the way to reach, I mean, we do this all the time, so we just put out a report pretty recently on refugees. I blast it out, and immediately the hate mail starts coming in. And the first message I get back is, you lie, refugees don't pay taxes. Well, it's like, well, that's a fact. I don't really know how to respond to that. And the reality is that to reach people, I mean, when someone is convinced and they're not sure, but they're open to the idea, the economic argument is fabulously important. But you're not going to get someone who's very anti-immigrant that way. And that's where I think storytelling is hugely important. I mean, we employ a team of freelance journalists, and all they do is compile stories all day long, because no one's going to listen to our data until they have some personal connection to it. I mean, I think the gay marriage, the LGBT connection was really good. I think millennials, it's not just because they're being taught diversity in schools that they see it, it's because people are out. I mean, you look at the gay marriage debate is not debate anymore because everyone knows someone who's gay. And I think that's similar with immigration. That the trajectory of immigration is not that all of a sudden you're going to have like an immigrant kid if you're not an immigrant, but now that immigrants are increasingly in all communities, you look at high schools right now, I mean, the diversity thing, the kids who are graduating schools, most of those are like half of the kids graduating high school right now are non-white. And so, I mean, diversity is not like a conceptual thing to this generation the way it was a generation ago. It's very real everywhere you go, and I think that's true with immigrants too. And so I think that's the hope for this administration is, it is certainly, I hope they'll start buying the economic arguments, but I don't think they're going to start buying it until it becomes very real personally. And I think that's a hard thing to do with people who are real ideologues.
So I want to give another round of applause to our amazing panel. And also, Rhoda, did you want to say any final words at all, or? You're good? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you all.